I tried. In the end, I did. I gave you all I had.
I've still yet to experience a game that's hit me quite like Red Dead Redemption 2. And at this point, I've probably watched Arthur's death scene a dozen times, and it still gets me. Every time. Here is a dying man alone on a mountainside, watching the sun rise over a world that never wanted him. His lungs are failing, his family has abandoned him, and everything that he's ever known is crumbling around him. But for the first time in his life, Arthur Morgan is at peace. And it makes you wonder, how did we get here? How did this man, this outlaw who spent most of his life harming and taking from others, become someone whose death feels like the most heroic thing he could have done? Arthur's story is not about a hero who falls from grace. It's not about a life of good deeds or storybook justice. It's about a man who never thought he was worth anything, slowly discovering that maybe he was wrong about himself all along. Arthur Morgan didn't just become my favorite gaming protagonist because he's brilliantly written or ruggedly handsome, though. Let's be honest, both are true. He became my favorite because he showed me something so rare in games: what quiet, everyday heroism actually looks like. A heroism that's messy, costly, and earned through struggle. And if you've been here for a little bit now, you already know that I care about stories that matter, characters with depth, and games that really understand what it is that they're trying to say. Arthur's story is about transformation, yes, but it's really about what happens when a man finally starts living by his choices instead of by his circumstances. When I think about male characters in gaming, there are very few that come to mind that have had an impact on me like Arthur Morgan. The phrase, "they just don't make them like they used to," perfectly encapsulates how I feel about his entire story and purpose as a character. But here's what makes Arthur different from so many other heroes that we see in games. He's not a chosen one. He doesn't have a destiny written in prophecy or supernatural powers that make him special. Arthur's heroism is completely accessible to all of us. It's built from daily choices, from deciding to show up when you don't have to, and from choosing to be better than you were yesterday. Arthur's story shows us a lot about what makes a real hero, what makes everyday actions authentic and meaningful versus performative, and his journey reveals that it isn't about grand gestures, taking up the spotlight, or perfect people making perfect choices. It's about making intentional and helpful decisions that serve others, making small changes to be better even when no one is watching, and even when you think it might be too late for you. So, if you haven't already guessed, fair warning, we're gonna get a little bit deep talking about this cowboy. Buckle up. To truly understand Arthur's transformation, we have to start with who he was before he started to change. When you really look at his origins, it's so heartbreaking how almost inevitable this path seemed. Arthur was orphaned at a very young age. He had no parents to look up to or take care of him, and he was most likely a very traumatized, lonely child. When he was found by Dutch and Hosea, they didn't just give him a home, they gave him an entire worldview, a complete identity that Arthur never had the chance to question because it was all he knew. And what's so tragic about this is that Arthur never really had the chance to discover who he might have been had he been raised differently. He didn't just wake up one day and decide, I want to be an outlaw. That choice was made for him by the environment he essentially had no say in, by the only father figure he ever had. When the people who love you, who feed you, who protect you, tell you that this is who you are, this is your purpose, you believe them because what else do you have? What else do you know? Fast forward through his years, and by the time we meet Arthur in 1899, he's not only fully bought into this worldview, it's been solidified down to his core. There's this line that he says early on in the game that just cuts right to the heart of how he sees himself in the game.
We're thieves in a world that don't want us no more.
This isn't Arthur being defiant. It's him being resigned. He's accepted and owned that he's society's enemy, that there's no place for him in the civilized world, and he seems almost comfortable with that notion. And when you take a look at Arthur's journal entries from early in the game, it's clear just how deeply this identity has taken root. The way he writes about violence like it's normal or even a good thing. He justifies hurting people by telling himself that they probably deserved it, or that it was necessary for the gang's survival. There's a very cold detachment in his words. Underlying everything he says, there's this constant thread that he is lost and damned, not as a cry for help, but as a simple statement about his life. You learn later in the game that Arthur's shame runs even deeper than just the gang violence. He was a father once to a boy named Isaac with a woman named Eliza, and he failed them both. Arthur chose the gang over his family, visiting only when it was convenient, occasionally sending money instead of showing up when they needed him most. When they were killed for the measly few dollars that they had, Arthur wasn't there to protect them. After you learn this, you see that failure haunts every page of his journal. It's a weight he carries that goes beyond just being an outlaw. He was a man who abandoned his own child, and that child died because Arthur chose his loyalty to Dutch over his responsibility as a father. Arthur carries this crushing weight of shame about his past and is convinced that shame is just who he is now. He doesn't see it as something to overcome. He sees it as proof that he is too far gone for any type of change, for any type of good. He's done terrible things, hurt innocent people, and failed the people who needed him most. And in his mind, that's not something you can ever come back from, reinforcing the identity imposed on him since childhood. So this is where we start. Arthur Morgan is numb and adrift, defined entirely by cruel survival and blind loyalty to his makeshift family that raised him to be a terror. He's not some cartoonish villain. He's not a soulless monster that chose his own path. He's just a man. A man so empty and lost, hollowed out by years of violence and guilt, and convinced that this hollowed version of himself is all there is and all there ever will be. When Arthur begins to see the possibility that there might be more, he doesn't go from completely numb to transformed overnight. That's not how real change works, and it's definitely not how Rockstar tells his story. Instead, what we get is this beautiful, painful, slow awakening that happens through dozens of moments. Some small, some big, and some that you might not even notice if you're not paying close attention. And as we get into all of this, please keep in mind that my viewpoint is coming from someone who mostly played the game with mid to low honor, but started working towards high honor probably around the halfway point, and definitely by the time Arthur visits the doctor. I know everyone has their own preference of how they think it should be played, but I do think that this progression really helps you get the absolute most out of this game. For me, it all really started with the different stranger encounters in the world. And I love these little pieces of storytelling in the game. You'll be riding along, minding your own business, and then suddenly there's this person who needs help. Maybe it's someone whose horse threw them, or a woman being harassed, or just someone in trouble. I also learned pretty early on that sometimes it's even a trap. Yeah, I got duped many times. But what's really cool is that Arthur gets to make a decision each time. He can ignore it and ride on by like the hardened outlaw he's supposed to be, or he can stop and help. The first few times you help someone, Arthur almost seems surprised by his own actions. Sometimes there are almost moments of confusion, like he's rediscovering parts of himself he thought long dead. You can almost see him even thinking, when did I care about strangers again? I remember the first time I saw that slight flicker of confusion cross his face after helping someone, and I just sat on my horse for a few moments after that. It was such a small thing, but it made me think about my own life. When was the last time I surprised myself by choosing kindness when I could have just walked away? But it's not just the strangers who see glimpses of the man Arthur could be. Watch how he treats his horse. The way he pats their neck after a long ride, murmurs gentle words when they're spooked, makes sure that they're fed and rested before he even thinks about his own needs. There is something so telling about a man who can be ruthless with people, but infinitely patient with an animal that depends on him completely. You can even almost see Arthur thinking, at least I can do right by you. It's such a small thing, but it reveals everything. Here is this hardened outlaw who talks to his horse like a friend, who gets genuinely upset if something happens to them. In a life where Arthur feels like he's failed everyone who's mattered, his horse becomes this one relationship where he can be purely good, purely protective, purely caring. It's a beautiful window into the man he's actually capable of being. Beyond the random encounters and the genuine compassion for his horse, the thing that's really front and center is his relationship with Dutch. Because as the game progresses, you start to notice these tiny cracks in the philosophy that Arthur's built his entire life around. Dutch gives these extremely fancy speeches about helping the poor and fighting the system and being better than the civilization that cast them out. But more and more, Arthur starts noticing that Dutch's grand plans seem to hurt the very people that they're supposed to be helping. The speeches start sounding empty, performative rather than principled, and Arthur begins asking those slippery slope questions. Not rebellious questions, not yet, but just, are we sure about this? Is this truly helping our family? Helping anyone? When you get to the Downs family debt collection, you see this perfect example of this internal war starting to surface. Arthur has been the debt collector for the group, and when his next job calls for him to intimidate this very sick man and his struggling family into paying money that they clearly don't have, something in him rebels against making their lives worse. He sees Thomas Downs coughing up blood, he sees the desperation in their eyes, and his conscience is at war with his duty. But what makes this scene so brutal to watch is Arthur doesn't just quietly feel bad about what he's doing. Arthur lashes out at them with a cruelty that's almost shocking. He's threatening them, and you start to realize what's happening here. It's this horrible psychological defense where he tries to silence his own guilt by being cruel to the people making him feel guilty. Like, if he can just be mean enough, loud enough, intimidating enough, maybe he can drown out that voice in his head that's telling him that this is wrong. He still collects what he can from the family, but you see it start to eat at him afterward, knowing that he didn't just hurt people who were already suffering, he was unnecessarily cruel to them because they dared to make him confront what kind of man he had become. And this encounter was, of course, so fateful for other reasons as well. If you read his journal during this period, you can see Arthur really start to wrestle with this view of himself in the gang. It's not that they're just hurting innocent people, it's that half the time, they're not even helping the gang. They're making enemies where they could have had allies, stirring up unnecessary trouble, causing all of this pain for what? Arthur's starting to realize that many of their actions aren't strategic, they're just plain vicious. He slowly begins to recognize that the life he's been living isn't even accomplishing what it was supposed to accomplish. He's been so loyal to the gang, so focused on following orders that he never stopped to ask whether or not those orders actually made sense. Was hurting that sick farmer or terrorizing that struggling family really protecting his own family, or just hurting people for the sake of it? Then comes the moment that changes everything. The scene where Arthur receives his diagnosis, insanity. I won't lie, the first time I experienced this, I had to pause the game and just sit there in complete silence for a few minutes. Thankfully, Rockstar allows us to be with Arthur and process this for a minute. And you can see it in his face, the way that everything he thought he knew about his life suddenly feels very small. For the first time in years, Arthur can't hide behind being busy or useful. He has to sit alone with who he's been, who he is. And here's what's so special about his response. He doesn't deny it, he doesn't rage against it, he doesn't immediately start making bargains with God. Instead, he starts asking himself the question, if this is who I've been, what do I want to be with the time that I have left? What really gets me about this moment is how physical it becomes. Arthur's world literally starts to shrink around him. He can't ride as far, he can't fight as hard, can't do the things that once truly defined him. Yet somehow, as his body fails, his moral vision becomes clearer than it's ever been. It's like losing a part of his physical strength forces him to discover a kind of different strength entirely. Facing death strips away every excuse he's ever made. No more, I'll change someday, or when things settle down, or when Dutch's plans finally work. Arthur realizes that someday just became never. He has now, maybe a few months if he's lucky. And that brutal clarity finally cracks his hardened exterior wide open. What follows is the most vulnerable we ever see Arthur Morgan. There's this moment where he seeks advice from Sister Calderon.
I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
Hearing this rugged, weathered man who's faced down entire gangs without flinching admit his fear hits like a punch to the gut. And it's not because he's afraid of dying, but because he finally understands that time isn't infinite, that every choice from here on out is his last chance to matter. If you were playing for high honor at this point like me, watch how immediately his priorities shift. Gang schemes that once consumed his every thought suddenly feel trivial. Money matters so much less than moments. Those quiet conversations around camp, the way he truly starts listening when people talk, how he sees past his own survival to the lives he could still impact. John, Abigail, and Jack. Making sure they have a future becomes everything to Arthur. The tuberculosis doesn't make Arthur good. It just finally makes him honest with the people around him, but most importantly, himself. And sometimes that's exactly where heroism begins. So Arthur has had this awakening. He knows his time is limited, but knowing you need to change and actually changing are two very different things. In my opinion, Rockstar absolutely nails what this transformation looks like. Post-diagnosis, Arthur doesn't just question his choices. He actively works to make things right. And this is where we see the most clear examples of what everyday heroism actually looks like. Remember the Downs family? The ones Arthur terrorized for debt money earlier on in the game. The dying farmer, Thomas, who was coughing up blood, ultimately the reason Arthur himself is dying. After Arthur gets his diagnosis, he does something so powerful. He seeks them out, not for the gang or because Dutch told him to, but because he wants to make it right. He finds Edith Downs and her son Archie struggling to survive, and he gives them the money that they need to start over. He helps them escape to a better life, knowing full well he'll never see a penny returned, and that Dutch would be so furious if he knew. What makes this even more impactful is understanding what this choice costs Arthur. He is using his limited time, his dwindling energy, risking Dutch's wrath, all to undo damage he caused when he was a very different man. Every mile he rides to find them is a mile his failing body struggles to handle, but he does it anyway. And I felt so proud of Arthur in that moment because it showed him actively choosing redemption over comfort. He could have just felt bad about what he did and moved on, but instead he put himself at risk in an attempt to undo the damage he'd caused. Then there's Charlotte Balfour, the widow that's struggling to survive alone in the wilderness. Arthur doesn't just happen upon her and leave, he deliberately takes time out of his increasingly precious days to teach her how to hunt, how to protect herself, how to live. There's no benefit to Arthur here, except the knowledge that he's helping someone who needs it. He becomes this extremely gentle, patient, kind teacher. But again, consider what this costs him. Hours of his limited remaining time, energy his sick body desperately needs, all given freely to a stranger who can offer him nothing in return. But the one change that really gets me is how Arthur's relationship with John transforms after the diagnosis. Before, Arthur saw John as kind of an irresponsible kid who abandoned the gang for a year. But now, Arthur truly sees John as Jack's father, as Abigail's husband, as someone who still has a future worth fighting for. Arthur starts deliberately mentoring John, teaching him not just how to survive, but how to be a better man, even if he doesn't realize it. He pushes John to step up, to take responsibility, to become the leader that his family needs. And we already know why Arthur is so invested in John stepping up. Arthur knows what it costs when a man chooses his gang over his family. He's lived with that regret every day since the death of his son and since his relationship with Mary Linton, who we'll touch on in just a moment. But when Arthur pushes John to be there for Jack, to be present, to choose his family over everything else, it's not just good advice. It's Arthur desperately trying to prevent John from making the same exact mistake that's haunted him for most of his life. At this point, Arthur also starts contributing more to the camp funds, not because he has to, but because he wants to make sure everyone is taken care of. He takes on the harder jobs, the more dangerous missions, because he knows his time is limited anyway, and he might as well use it to protect the people who still have years ahead of them. What's so powerful about this transformation is that Arthur's heroism becomes completely intentional. He is not accidentally stumbling into good deeds, he's deliberately seeking out opportunities and choosing to use whatever time he has left to serve others. Every choice reveals not just an evolving moral compass, but a man who has finally discovered his purpose. Arthur doesn't just reject the identity that was forced on him as a child, he actively chooses to build a new one. Instead of Dutch's enforcer, he becomes the camp's protector. Instead of taking orders, he becomes someone who takes accountability. Instead of being the gang's weapon, he becomes their provider. Not just by bringing in money, but bringing in hope, stability, and care. Watch Arthur in those final months, and you see a man deliberately crafting a new identity for himself. He's not just drifting away from who he was, he's intentionally stepping into who he wants to be. When he mentors John, he's choosing to be a teacher. When he helps the Downs family, he's choosing to be a healer. When he protects Sadie and the other women in camp, he's choosing to be a guardian. It's like Arthur finally realizes that just because Dutch raised him to be lost and damned, it doesn't mean that he has to stay that way. He has the ability to rewrite his story, to craft a new story. And the story that he chooses to write is one of a man who shows up, a man who takes care of people, a man who uses his strength to build rather than to tear down. Arthur gives us a great example of what servant leadership looks like. Using your strength to lift others up. Making decisions based on what serves the people that you care about rather than what benefits you. He becomes a kind of shepherd figure, naturally taking responsibility for others' well-being. Not because he has to, but because he willingly chooses to care for them. Arthur also demonstrates incredible humility. He never acts like he's better than anyone. Even as he's becoming this new moral compass for the gang, he doesn't lord it over them or act like he is some kind of saint. He still sees himself as just Arthur. He still calls himself a bad man. He still doesn't think that he deserves the respect that people give him. There's zero ego. No self-righteousness. He just quietly does what he now knows is right. And he does what needs to be done, and he moves on. That humility makes his heroism so much more powerful because it makes it more genuine. He's not trying to be anyone's savior. He's just trying to be a better man. And with this growth of his character, you get to see how Rockstar nails the balancing of Arthur being tough and tender. When you really watch him and see how he develops over time, Arthur never once loses his strength when choosing compassion or kindness. In fact, his choices amplify it. He is still tough, still capable of incredible violence when necessary. But now, that toughness is guided by wisdom and compassion for others, rather than just survival instinct. He has finally learned the difference between righteous strength and reckless cruelty. Now, to touch on this transformation a little bit further, throughout your journey, Arthur has these dreams where he sees either a deer or a wolf. And at first, you might think it's just random imagery, but very quickly you realize it's not random at all. The deer represents everything Arthur could become: vulnerability, peace, gentleness, and there's something deeply intentional about this choice of animal. Take Psalm 42, for example. As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. The deer represents how Arthur's soul is literally thirsting for something better than what he's been. This quiet, graceful creature embodies the man Arthur is slowly discovering he can be, even after everything that he's done. If you're focused on high honor choices throughout the game, you'll keep seeing this deer in Arthur's dreams. It becomes this reoccurring reminder of the path that he's choosing, this visual confirmation that his soul is seeking something more, something pure and peaceful. And the more you lean into compassion and service, the more prominent this beautiful symbol becomes. Then there's the wolf, aggressive, predatory, all about survival at any cost. That's the outlaw Arthur's always been, the weapon Dutch shaped him into. Raw, violent, focused only on the pack and personal survival. Which animal you see depends entirely on the choices you've been making, but the game is constantly showing us this internal battle. It's not just a few scattered dreams, it's an ongoing visual representation of Arthur's subconscious, wrestling with who he wants to be versus who he has always been. This war inside Arthur, between the wolf and the deer, violence and peace, it isn't just symbolic. It's preparing us for the real test, because eventually every internal battle becomes external, and Arthur's final choice isn't just about survival, it's about loyalty versus truth, family versus integrity, and most of all, whether he'll still choose to do good even when everything around him falls apart. And as we get closer to this point later in the game, we're also introduced to Mary Linton along the way, Arthur's one true love, the woman who represents everything he could have been if he'd just chosen differently earlier on in his life. When Mary reaches out to him, asking for help with her family, Arthur doesn't hesitate. He drops everything to help her, even knowing it will reopen old wounds. In their final conversation together, Mary asks Arthur yet again to run away with her, to leave it all behind and start over. Arthur, the same man who's been questioning everything, who's been trying to change, looks at the woman that he loves and he says no. Not because he doesn't love her, not because he wouldn't want to spend the rest of his life with her, but because he loves her way too much to drag her down with him.
Is it too late for us, Arthur?
I can't lie to you. I wanted man, Mary. If anyone close to me, well, they're wanted to, and I can't have you wrapped up in there.
When he says this, he truly means it. Arthur chooses to let her go because he knows that she deserves better than what he can give her. Sacrifice out of love truly is one of the most powerful acts that someone can commit, and Arthur shows us exactly what that can look like with this choice. He lets go of the person he loves most because staying would hurt her. Arthur has spent his whole life being selfish, but when it comes to Mary, he finally learns what it means to love someone more than yourself and to put their needs ahead of your own. This finally brings us to the moment where Arthur gets to the undeniable fork in the road, Dutch's descent into madness, and Arthur's impossible choice between loyalty and truth. We've known something was going on, that something was building. It's hard to miss Micah always whispering into Dutch's ear like Wormtongue in Lord of the Rings. Micah doesn't just poison Dutch's mind, he comes after Arthur with everything he's got. He spreads lies, sows doubt, tries to turn the entire gang against him. He questions Arthur's loyalty, his motives, tries to make it seem like Arthur's the problem. But here's what I love about Arthur. He doesn't fight fire with fire. He doesn't stoop to Micah's level. Arthur just keeps being Arthur. He keeps doing what he knows is right. He keeps serving the people he cares about. He keeps telling the truth, even when lies would be easier. That integrity, that refusal to compromise who he's becoming just because someone is trying to tear him down, that's such a great example of real strength. Arthur could have played the politics. He could have fought back, fought dirty, but he chooses to stay true to the man he's trying to become, even when it costs him Dutch's trust, even when it makes his life harder. Dutch's fantastical plans continue to get worse and worse, and they cause so much more harm than good. And watching Dutch go from a father figure to a truly evil antagonist who ultimately betrays Arthur is one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever experienced in a game. Dutch was everything to Arthur. Mentor, father, the one who took him in, raised him, and became the architect of his entire identity and worldview. Slowly, very painfully, we watch pride and paranoia consume him until he becomes completely unrecognizable. And like I mentioned before, Dutch starts making decisions that hurt the very people he claims to be protecting. His grand speeches about helping the poor and fighting the system start sounding extremely empty and performative rather than principled. Arthur, who's now been questioning things for months, finally reaches his breaking point. Arthur's final chapters become this desperate race to save whatever can still be saved. He can't save Dutch. Dutch has chosen his path. He can't save the gang. It's already broken beyond repair. But maybe he can save John, Abigail, and Jack. Maybe he can make sure that they get the chance at a normal life that he never had. Arthur pours everything he has left into that last mission. He gives John his hat, his satchel, his blessing. Arthur strips away everything that tied him to his old life and hands it over to someone who still has a future.
You're my brother. I know.
The final confrontation he has with Micah isn't about revenge, it's about protection. One last act of service, one final choice to put others before himself. And when he utters his last words to Dutch, he really means them.
I gave you all I had. I did.
Then comes that sunrise on Mount Hagen, with Arthur finally at peace, watching the light break over the mountains. After a lifetime of darkness, he finally gets to see the dawn. Arthur's story doesn't really end with his death. Because of who he became in those final months, his choices end up shaping those around him for the rest of their lives. John is a changed man because of him. For a time, he starts to step up as a father, a husband, someone who protects instead of just survives. And it's not because Arthur gave him some grand speech. It's because Arthur lived it out as an example, quietly and consistently. That's the thing about real leadership. It leaves a mark and changes the people who experience it. It doesn't force itself. It demonstrates by example. and inspires change. What makes Arthur a real leader and hero to the people around him, especially when you put him side by side with someone like Dutch, is that he stops chasing the illusion. He starts telling the truth, even when it hurts. He cares. Not about the plan, not about money or legacy, but about people. Dutch talks about being a leader, about having a vision, about changing the world, but Arthur just quietly serves. He doesn't need speeches or plans. He just shows up and he lets his actions do the talking. He's there, he's present, and there's something so powerful about that kind of leadership, the kind that does not demand to be followed, but inspires people to follow all on their own. The kind of leadership that doesn't seek its own glory, but it lifts up others. Arthur proves that it is never too late to become who you are supposed to be, and that forgiveness and choosing to do better are possible for anyone. His heroism isn't about being fearless, it's about faithful love in action. It's about moral courage, the strength to change when change is hard, the willingness to serve rather than to be served. It's found in ordinary moments of choosing others over yourself, the daily decisions that reveal who you are when no one is watching. And maybe that's why his story hits me so hard, because it didn't just make me admire him, it made me reflect on some of my own choices, on what type of person I am, and the kind of impact I'm leaving behind in my own life. When no one is watching, who am I choosing to be? When it's easier to walk away, do I stay? When it costs me something to help someone else, do I help anyway? Arthur's story reminds me that we're all broken people, but that doesn't mean that we have to stay that way. There's something so beautiful about watching a man who thought he was beyond redemption discover that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong about himself all along. The truth really can set you free, even when that truth is painful, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Arthur Morgan reminds me why I love stories that understand what heroism actually is. He showed me that the most powerful transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in the quiet daily choice to be better than you were yesterday. Real change happens in the small moments, in the choice to tell the truth when lying would be easier, in the decision to give when you could take, in the courage to love when you could just walk away. His story confirms that redemption isn't just possible, it's available to anyone willing to stop making excuses and start making different choices. And sometimes that's the most heroic thing you can do. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply choosing to be different than you were. In the end, Arthur Morgan became the man he was always meant to be. Not Dutch's weapon, not society's outcast, but a protector, a father figure, a friend. Someone who chose love over fear, truth over comfort, others over himself. Someone who understood that real strength isn't about what you can take, it's about what you're willing to give. You really are a good man, Arthur Morgan. And thank you for showing me what that looks like. So, if you've made it to the end of this video, I know this one was a little bit different. Thank you for going on this pretty emotional journey with me. And I know I couldn't cover everything about our favorite cowboy here, but what is a moment in Arthur's journey that hit you the hardest? Or maybe a time when you've seen that kind of quiet heroism in real life? Please drop it in the comments, because honestly, I would love to cry over your stories too. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.